What I'm about to share with you is going to sound strange, even unsettling. But stay with me, because once you hear it through, you'll notice how it quietly flips much of what we've been taught about attraction and desire. For over a century, mainstream psychology has left certain truths buried. Some of them were ignored because they didn't fit the cultural mood. Others were actively suppressed because the implications were too explosive. This isn't going to be another surface-level talk about dating tips or pop psychology cliches. What you're about to hear traces back to Freud himself and to the stories he didn't dare publish in his lifetime. These were not wild speculations, but things he recorded in his private letters and case notes, things that shook him to the core. Let's start with one of those cases. In 1895, Freud treated a wealthy Viennese aristocrat. Let's call her Anna. She came to him suffering from what doctors at the time described as hysterical fits. She was exhausted, trapped in a marriage she despised, and overwhelmed by urges she couldn't explain. Freud began probing deeper into her subconscious, and what he uncovered challenged everything he thought he knew about human desire. Anna's inner world didn't match the image of the refined, proper woman. She fantasized about domination, about humiliation, even about situations society would have considered taboo or monstrous. And the shocking part? Freud came to believe she wasn't an exception. She was closer to the rule. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "The civilized woman is a facade. Beneath it lies a chaos of primal impulses, a hunger that dares not speak its name." And Anna wasn't the only one. Another patient, Dora, just 18 years old, was brought to Freud by her father after she accused a family friend of making unwanted advances. Freud's published notes suggest something far more complicated than simple trauma. According to his analysis, Dora's hysteria wasn't only about rejecting this man. On some level, she was frustrated because he stopped pursuing her once she resisted. Freud described this pattern as the eroticization of refusal, the idea that rejection itself can fuel attraction, and that the withholding of satisfaction can sometimes intensify desire.
Now, take a step back and think about that in the context of modern dating. Today, we're constantly told persistence is harassment. No means no. Attraction should be clear and enthusiastic. And yes, socially, that's the framework we live by. But if Freud's observations hold any weight, then what goes on beneath the surface isn't always aligned with those ideals. History and literature are full of examples of attraction thriving in the tension of pursuit, denial, and challenge. From Cleopatra carefully resisting Caesar to the medieval troubadours singing endlessly about unattainable noblewomen, the pattern keeps reoccurring. Freud didn't stop there. His most controversial claim, one that got distorted, mocked, and burned in book bans, was what he called penis envy. The term is crude, but what he actually meant was less about anatomy and more about agency. He believed women were raised to receive rather than take, to find their pleasure through the energy and initiative of men rather than from their own direct control. According to Freud, this gap in agency created fantasies centered on pursuit, dominance, and surrender. And if that sounds far-fetched, think about some modern parallels. Why do billionaire romance novels dominate bestseller lists? Why does the rise of independence and equality in the workplace seem to run alongside an explosion of BDSM and dominance/submission fantasies in private life? Freud would have said it's the same paradox playing out: public equality coexisting with private fantasies of imbalance. Later researchers stumbled on similar patterns. Alfred Kinsey, often called the father of modern sexology, conducted experiments in the 1950s measuring physiological arousal. One of the more controversial findings was that women's bodies often reacted more strongly to stories of forced seduction than to straightforward, consensual scenarios. Their physical responses contradicted their morals. But instead of publishing that data prominently, Kinsey buried it, knowing it would spark outrage.
So what does all of this mean in practice? It suggests that the kinds of games men are told to avoid, the push and pull, the teasing, the tension, might not just be manipulative tricks, they might actually be biological triggers wired into attraction itself. It might explain why the nice guy stereotype often falls flat, not because kindness is bad, but because predictability is dull. It might explain why, even in an era of vocal calls for equality, fantasies of inequality remain so dominant in private imagination. By the time Freud had pulled all of this together, he realized he was holding something too dangerous to release to the world at large. His colleagues censored portions of his work. His followers reshaped his theories into gentler, more acceptable versions. And yet the core observations never fully went away. They re-emerged in fragments, in studies, in literature, and in the quiet confessions of people who admitted that desire didn't always follow logic. And here's the setup for where we go next. Because this isn't just about dusty case notes from a century ago. Ignoring these truths has real-world consequences today. We're living in what some have called a sexless society, where men are pulling back from dating altogether, frustrated and disillusioned, where the rules of kindness, equality, and unending respect seem to backfire, where women themselves often feel stuck between what they think they should want and what actually excites them. That's where we'll pick up in the next section, how Freud's warnings were ignored, how generations of men were taught to suppress their instincts, and how this has quietly reshaped modern relationships in ways few people are willing to talk about.
So let's pick up where we left off. Freud warned that if men suppressed their instincts too much, if society demanded they neuter themselves, then attraction would eventually collapse. And here's the thing, looking at the world today, that prediction doesn't feel so far off. Take this for example. The average man under 30 right now is 3 times more likely to be celibate than his father was at the same age. 3 times. That's not just a statistic, it's a generational shift. Dating apps, which were supposed to make connection easier, have turned into ruthless sorting machines. The top 10% of men, those who are either the most attractive, the most charismatic, or the most socially dominant, end up getting 90% of female attention. Everyone else is left fighting over scraps. Now think about what that means. For a lot of men, following the rules of being kind, supportive, and endlessly respectful isn't getting them anywhere. In fact, it's often working against them. Meanwhile, the men who seem to win in this new market are often the ones who lean into intensity, unpredictability, and dominance, the very traits Freud identified as fueling attraction over a century ago. This isn't just speculation. In 2018, a team at the University of Oslo ran a study on Tinder behavior. The results? Women rated 85% of men as below average in attractiveness, not just not their type, below average. The harsh reality was that many women would rather share access to a top-tier man than settle for someone loyal but boring. Why? Because monotony kills desire. Freud himself referred to this as the boredom principle, the idea that we adapt quickly to comfort, but we stay hooked on challenge and change. And if you think this is a modern glitch caused by technology, look back further. In the 1950s, psychologist John Money studied how people responded to images and scenarios involving different personality types. The women in his experiments reported attraction to kind and stable men, but their physiological responses betrayed something else. Their pupils dilated, their heart rate spiked, and their skin conductance increased
when shown images of dominant or even dangerous men. Just like Kinsey, money buried much of that data because it clashed with the narrative of equality and progress that was gaining ground.
But here's where it gets even more fascinating. These patterns don't just show up in lab experiments. They appear in culture everywhere you look. Romance novels, the most consistently popular book genre on the planet, are dominated by stories featuring morally gray anti-heroes, mafia bosses, and powerful men who bend the rules. Platforms like OnlyFans explode, not because women flock to men who are respectful and safe, but because they pay for the attention of aloof, dominant figures. Even in politics, history shows us a pattern. Charismatic strongmen almost always outpoll soft-spoken reformers when it comes to female support. Freud had a term for this pull toward dark energy, the Thanatos effect. It's the unconscious attraction to destruction, to danger, to power that doesn't ask for permission. And whether we like it or not, ignoring this pull doesn't make it disappear. It just drives it underground. Now, none of this is about blaming women. Freud was very clear on that point. Desire is something anyone fully controls, not men, not women. We're all subject to the same biological wiring. The difference, Freud argued, is that society often allows women to indulge in their contradictions while men get punished for theirs. For example, a man who admits he wants a submissive partner might be shamed, but a woman who fantasizes about a dominant man is celebrated, at least as long as she frames it in socially acceptable terms. We can see the contradiction play out in other historical examples too. Think of the Stanford prison experiment in 1971. The focus was on how quickly people assumed roles of power and submission. What rarely gets talked about is how the female researchers in the study reacted. Despite condemning the guards' cruelty, many admitted feeling drawn to them. A similar pattern happened in Nazi Germany, where women who publicly opposed fascism were privately obsessed with SS officers. As Freud put it bluntly, the erotic mind has no conscience. Despite condemning the guards' cruelty, many admitted feeling drawn to them. A similar pattern happened in Nazi Germany, where women who publicly opposed fascism were privately obsessed with SS officers. As Freud put it bluntly, the erotic mind has no conscience. So where does this leave us? Does it mean men have to become monsters to be attractive? Not at all. The men who actually thrive in this landscape aren't the ones resenting female nature or trying to fight it. They're the ones who understand it and work with it. They realize that attraction is built on tension, not logic. They know that being endlessly available or predictable is the fastest way to get overlooked. And they also know the solution isn't manipulation, it's mastery. Freud's insight was that women test men for strength, not out of cruelty, but out of survival instinct. For most of human history, a weak partner meant danger. So those tests we hear about, the pushbacks, the mixed signals, the fights, they're not random, they're filtering mechanisms. And most men fail them without ever realizing what's happening. So here's the transition point. If modern dating feels like psychological warfare, that's because in some ways it is. The rules are no longer clear, the narratives don't match reality, and millions of men are caught in the middle, confused, rejected, and increasingly opting out altogether. In the next section, we're going to talk about how to navigate this without falling into bitterness. Freud's ultimate insight wasn't about control, it was about polarity. We'll explore how men who master polarity don't just attract women, but maintain respect and desire long-term. And we'll get into practical strategies for applying these ideas in your own life without losing your integrity. So let's bring this all together. If you've been following along, you've seen how Freud uncovered truths about attraction that were too uncomfortable for his time, and in many ways, still too uncomfortable for ours. You've also seen how ignoring these truths has led to what some call the sexless society, a world where men feel frustrated,
Women feel conflicted, and relationships collapse under the weight of unmet expectations. The question now is, what do you actually do with this knowledge? The answer begins with understanding polarity. Polarity is the magnetic tension between two opposing energies. Think of it as the push and pull that creates attraction. Without polarity, relationships flatten out into comfort and routine. With polarity, they stay alive, charged, and unpredictable. Freud argued that this dynamic between surrender and conquest, between pursuit and resistance, isn't a cultural invention, but something wired deep into human psychology. And here's where it gets practical. If you're a man watching this, you've probably been told to be more vulnerable, more available, more accommodating. And while vulnerability has its place, Freud's case studies showed something crucial. The moment a man surrendered his role as the psychological anchor, the woman's respect for him evaporated. One wife in his notes put it in plain words, "I begged him to be more vulnerable. Then when he was, I couldn't look at him the same way." That's the paradox. Women often ask for certain behaviors, but attraction responds to something else entirely. The trick isn't to ignore what women say, but to understand how desire operates on two levels, the conscious and the unconscious.
So what does that look like in everyday life? Let's break it down. First, the silence strategy. When she tests you, and she will, don't rush to defend yourself, explain, or argue. Silence is powerful. Freud noted that silence forces the female mind to invest more emotionally. The less you justify, the more she wonders. The more she wonders, the more invested she becomes. Second, the decisive imperative. Women may say they want endless input, but study after study shows they're more attracted to decisiveness. In 2022, researchers found that women reported significantly higher attraction to men who made plans without polling them for every detail. Not because they want to be controlled, but because decisiveness signals cognitive dominance, and dominance, in this context, is erotic. Third, the reward and withdrawal loop. This isn't about manipulation, it's about living by your standards. When she behaves in ways that align with what you value, reward her with attention and presence. When she doesn't, withdraw that attention. Not in anger, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of your boundaries. Freud's notes made it clear, women value attention most from men who don't hand it out cheaply.
Now, here's the deeper layer. The ultimate secret isn't about women at all. It's about you. Attraction collapses the moment you put her at the center of your life. The moment you make her the prize, you've already lost. But when you live by your own code, pursue your own mission, and treat relationships as something you invite rather than chase, that's when polarity flips in your favor. She begins the chase. And this is why the nice guy fails. Not because kindness is bad, but because he treats approval as the goal. He orbits her world instead of building his own. Desire doesn't spark in that space. Respect doesn't grow in that space. What grows, instead, is boredom. On the other hand, the man who holds frame, the man who is unshakable in his own purpose, creates a different experience. He doesn't demand respect, he commands it simply by being rooted in who he is. He doesn't control, he invites surrender. He doesn't manipulate, he polarizes. This is Freud's darkest, most misunderstood insight, that desire often despises what it consciously begs for, and that the role of a man, if he wants to keep attraction alive, is to understand that contradiction and move within it. Not bitterly, not resentfully, but with awareness. So, where does this leave you? It leaves you with a choice. You can keep playing by the rules society feeds you, rules that sound good on paper but fail in practice. Or you can step back, study the hidden dynamics, and learn to master polarity in a way that keeps your integrity intact. Because the real power move isn't about manipulation. It isn't about being cruel or heartless. It's about presence.
about being so grounded in who you are that the tests, the games, the pushbacks, they don't rattle you. You don't chase, you don't plead, you don't explain. You hold your frame. And that's what flips the script. That's what pulls desire toward you instead of pushing it away.
So, if you've ever wondered why she chose him over you, if you've ever felt invisible despite doing all the right things, maybe it's not you that's broken. Maybe it's the script you were given. Freud's work suggests you were never powerless. You were just misled. And once you see that, once you understand the deeper forces at play, you can start living differently. Not chasing, not resenting, just holding your ground and letting polarity do the work. This is the Freudian secret that rewires female desire. And now, it's in your hands.